Um, Before we begin this event, it's important to do so in a good way. So I would like to do so by reminding myself and reminding all of us and acknowledging the territories that folks of us here in person are gathered together on. The folks here in person, we are gathered on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Chippewa, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also have people joining us from both sides of the medicine line all across Turtle Island. My name is Rohit Revi. I am a socialist. I'm a member of the International Socialists from the Toronto East branch. I don't think I get to say I'm a newcomer on these lands because I've been here for around 7-8 years. But I'm a first-generation immigrant, and while I'm saying that, I'm just saying that to emphasize that all of us here have different relationships to these territories and to the territories that you are on. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and also say that to begin with, the land acknowledgement is not just to acknowledge the territories, but to also commit and recommit to be part of meaningful struggles for Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous sovereignty here on Turtle Island, but also across the world, whether it be Palestine or Kashmir. So I just wanted to emphasize that as we begin and welcome everyone again. So this meeting is co-sponsored by the International Socialists, by Marx 21 US, Another Story Bookshop, United Jewish People's Order, and Independent Jewish Voices, Toronto. The book launch that we are here today, as you know, is for the book, The Radical Jewish Tradition. I'll say a few words in the beginning, and then, of course, pass it over to introduce our speakers and pass it over to them. So the Radical Jewish Tradition tells the inspiring and lesser known story of working class Jews, together with their non-Jewish neighbors who took on the bosses, the czars, and the fascists. This book is recommended reading for all Jewish people who are looking into their histories for alternatives to Zionism, but it's also meant for a more general audience too. All readers interested in uncovering the roots of racism, understanding the way the ruling classes need scapegoats to divide and rule, and for those interested in learning strategies for cross-cultural movements against oppression will get something out of the Radical Jewish Tradition. And in that sense, it's an important book. It's an important topic for us in more ways than one. Before I pass it on to our speakers, I want to explain the format for a second. So we'll have Donny and Janey speak for about 15 minutes each respectively, and then we'll have Judy and Julia for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion where I'll open the floor for speakers list, both online and here in person. Please put your hand up. I'll make a note. I'll call on you. And if you're in the room, I'll request you to come closer to the laptop to ask your question, to make your point, to make your comment for up to 3 minutes. But I'll just go over this again when we are there. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce the speakers that we have. So I'll begin by introducing Donny Gluckstein, Donny is the son of an anti-Zionist Jewish Palestinian refugee father and Jewish South African mother. He is the author of several works that touch on the subject matter of the book, including The Nazis, Capitalism and the Working Class, A People's History of the Second World War, The Western Soviets, and The Tragedy of Bukharin. I have a copy of The Western Soviets that I hope to get signed by you. He edited Fighting on All Fronts, Popular Resistance in the Second World War. Donny lives in Edinburgh, UK, and continues to write books on revolutionary and socialist topics while in retirement. Please give a round of applause and welcome Donny.
Thanks. The comrade said very correctly, actually, that this is not a book about Jews. This is a book that actually is far more important and far bigger in terms of its scope, because it actually, and it's also not a book about history, because it touches on very immediate issues that we're facing today. The first one that you cannot it could not notice is the rise of the far right and the crisis of capitalism. And in that situation, we see today, just as back in the 1930s, the ruling class needs to turn to divide and rule tactics, and anti-Semitism is part of their armory. So the book deals with that. In other words, the growth of the far right is part of the book that is being discussed. And I don't know if you have in Canada the Great Replacement theory, because in the Great Replacement theory, the argument goes that a conspiracy of international Jews is bringing Muslims, this is into Europe, to overturn the Christians and all that sort of garbage. So that's the first thing that, in a sense, the book addresses. Second thing that the book addresses is what's happening in Palestine. The claim that the Israelis make, the Israeli state makes, that it represents all Jews for all time. For the last 2,000 years, when they declared independence, they say, we represent the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. This book, I hope, blows that completely out of the water. And the third thing that it addresses is the idea that the left is anti-Semitic. It's not the anti-Semites are no longer anti-Semitic. It's the left that's anti-Semitic, the people that actually have the tradition of fighting anti-Semitism throughout the past. So it addresses all of those three things. And I think that's important. So on the first accusation that Jews are trying to manipulate, what we discover in the history here is that Jews did not manipulate anybody. They worked with everybody in solidarity to lift everyone. So it's not a manipulation, it's a common struggle. That's the first thing that comes out very, very clearly. The second thing that comes out very clearly is that Zionism, you can date it back to 1896. And actually, it had no hold on the Jewish population, really, until Hitler came along. And so the book deals with that. And the third thing that it deals with is when you look at the struggle and the fight against anti-Semitism, it always came from the left. The right brought it forward and the left fought back against it. So these three lessons are quite important. And the final thing that I think needs to be addressed before I go into the actual the tradition itself is the importance and the strength of bringing together the struggle against oppression, in this case, anti-Semitism, racism, and exploitation. This is a story about the working class. It's not a story about Jews, because Jews can be from all classes. This is a story about working class Jews fighting both their oppression and their exploitation, and that is really, really explosive. Okay, so where does this tradition come from? Because I'm describing this wonderful thing. How do we know it actually existed? Well, what were its material roots? And I'll run through it fairly quickly. Well, and we need to go back to European feudalism. So this is not covering all Jews across the whole of the world. It starts off in Europe, where the vast majority of Jews are actually living, by the way. It's a landed society with two classes. The landed classes, the knights and the nobles and all of those people, the landowners, and the people who work the land. They're bound together ideologically through Christianity. But those are the two classes. There is nothing in between. Virtually no towns, virtually no trade, virtually no finance, none of that sort of thing. And they needed an external group who happened to be Jewish. It could have been anybody, but actually it happened to be Jews who had migrated into Europe for various reasons that fulfilled that role. So they are there in the towns carrying out these various functions, small-scale manufacture, all of that sort of stuff. And when anything goes wrong, who do you blame? You blame the non-Christian. So the Crusades are going on. And when Muslims are being winning in Jerusalem, you can't get at the Muslims in Jerusalem, so you attack the Jews that are living locally in your area. So you get the first sort of pogroms taking place around that. And the big one, from the point of view of the radical Jewish tradition, was the Black Death. 1349, the plague kills third half of the entire European population. Who do you blame? The Jews, of course. So what happened in Germany in particular, 75% of all Germany had anti-Jewish pogroms. And that's why Jews who lived there in large numbers migrated to the east. Yiddish, if anybody's heard the language Yiddish, heard of the language Yiddish, it's German, it's Low German, it's a dialect of German. And they carried that into Eastern Europe. Why into Eastern Europe? Because King Casimir III of Poland, God love him, needed that section of traders, small scale manufacture, etc. They wanted that in Poland to develop his state. So they're invited in. And so what we end up with is over half of the of the Jewish population in the world living in an area which will eventually be called the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement, it gets that name when the Tsar takes over the area, and it includes Poland, and it includes parts of Ukraine, Lithuania, and so on and so forth. So mass of Jews living in this place. This is in the 1790s onwards. That's when the Tsars have taken over this part of the world. Okay, and I want to move very swiftly. Hundreds of years pass in a flash of an eyelid. We come to the rise of capitalism, industrial capitalism in the 19th century. And by a quirk of history, industrialization takes place through it comes into Russia through the Pale of Settlement, because from where you're sitting, where I'm from, England is over here, James Watt and the steam engine, all that sort of stuff. Russia is over here, Poland's in between. And so the flow of industry develops via Poland. And Poland is the economic hub of the Russian Empire in the early years of the 19th century and towards the middle of the 19th century. It's where the Jews are living. They're only allowed to live in the Pale of Settlement. That's what they are confined to, because the Tsar doesn't want them wandering around the rest of his empire. So that's the situation. And as that capitalism develops and that industry develops, you get a class divide between upper class Jews and working class Jews. That community had been bound together, living in ghettos, etc., etc. The oppression had bound them together. The bond between the upper and lower was stronger than the divisions between them. Capitalism smashes that. And so you have Jewish workers siding with non-Jewish workers to fight Jewish and non-Jewish bosses. So you're getting a class division that's taking place. Okay, and then the year 1881 comes along. And in 1881, a group of Narodniks, who are Russian anarchists, go into a boarding house and they stay overnight, and the next day they go out and they assassinate the Tsar. Okay? Because that boarding house happens to be owned by a Jewish woman, the Tsars launched a mass of pogroms, a huge wave of anti-Jewish riots, and they had this very simple slogan. And at least in those days, they were a bit honest about what they were up to. It went like this: save the Tsar, beat the Jews. That was the slogan. In other words, it was very obvious what was going on. And so that's the objective basis for the Jewish radical tradition. A mass of Jewish workers who are identifying as left, as anti-capitalist, as fighting against bosses, whether they're Jewish bosses or not Jewish bosses. But there's a subjective reason as well, and I want to mention three people: Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, and Leon Trotsky. All of them were of Jewish origin. I mean, Karl Marx was not baptized and things, but his father was a rabbi, and as far as Hitler was concerned, it didn't matter, what religion you had. It was a biological thing. He would have been counted as Jewish. Same for Rosa Luxemburg, the leader of the Polish community, Polish socialist movement, and later the German communist movement, and of course Leon Trotsky, the key figure in the Russian Revolution next to Lenin. Neither Lenin nor Engels nor Karl Liebknecht were Jewish, by the way. So it's not a conspiracy. It was the solidarity of those three people with the others in the leadership. Why were they so important? Where did it come from? Because of anti-Semitism, because of that oppression, Jews, and because of their internationalism, because Jews are an international community spread right across, they didn't buy in to the rising nationalist movements that were going all across Europe at the time. So, while nationalism is running riot in Britain and in France and in Germany and so on and so forth, they don't buy into it because they've got relatives in all these different countries. And not just that, because of the anti-Semitism, they see society not as this is our society, because this is a society that tells them to get lost. So they see society from a much more objective, because they're looking at it from the outside. So I think there's both an objective basis to the radical Jewish tradition and a subjective one as well. Okay, let's move on. Because what I want to do now is to give you, and I'm sorry to run through a list of statistics, but I think they're quite impressive statistics. How big was the radical Jewish tradition? How important was it? You know, I hope I've proved why it existed, but how important was it? Okay, some statistics. 4% of the Russian population are Jewish. Sorry, yes, that's right. 4% of the Russian population are Jewish. They are twice the proportion in the revolutionary movements, you know, given compared to their numbers there. 1/3 of the delegates to Bolshevik party conferences were Jewish. Right? Petrograd, 1917, the core of the Russian Revolution. Petrograd is several hundred miles away from the Pale of Settlement, so Jews are not allowed to live there. 0.3% of the workforce in Petrograd is Jewish, 0.3%. And during the revolution, they have the most democratic body that has ever existed, which is the Soviet. Directly elected, immediately recallable, etc., etc. I won't ask you to guess what the proportion of Jews was, but it was the following. There were 35 in this Soviet executive, 11 of them were Jewish. Okay? And I want to move on to the international scale, because what happened with the pogroms meant that you had a mass flow of people away from Eastern Europe to the rest of the world, to the United States, to Canada, Australia, Britain, all over the place. And they carried with them the radical Jewish tradition. So that you see the statistics continue. Jews are 1/40 of the US population. They were 50% of the American Communist Party in the 1920s to 30s. The international brigades fighting Franco in Spain. 1 in 4, I didn't know this until I researched this book, 1 in 4 were Jewish. So the radical Jewish tradition is everywhere. And the final one I want to mention, because my mum came from there, it was mentioned earlier, South Africa. Jews are 0.3% of the population, that's statistic again, 0.3% of the population. 2.5% of the white population. The first trial, it's called the Great Treason Trial for fighting apartheid, half of the whites were Jewish. They're only 2.5% of the white population. When Mandela was put on trial, every single white person on trial with him was Jewish. Okay, so that's the implantation, if you like, the explosive radicalizing effect of oppression and exploitation at the same time. I want to move very quickly on to what political form does this take? And you can really see 3 currents. The first one, which I mentioned already, is the Marxist current. And that is where there's absolute solidarity and the same organization of revolutionary socialists, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. They're together in the same revolutionary organization. The second form is the Bund. And I think Janey will talk a bit more about the Bund, but the Bund is an intermediate position in the sense that these are radicalized Jewish workers who identify as Jewish and don't think they should be part of a non-Jewish organization, or that they see it as a separate role, if you like. So it's halfway, towards the Marxist position, but not fully there. But what you can say is this: both of those currents were absolutely agreed that they hated Zionism, right? They're both totally opposed to Zionism. The third current is Zionism, and Zionism was a current, and it could be extremely left-wing. People probably forget that Zionism was dominated by what was called Labour Zionism or Socialist Zionism. It never really was, but for between 1930 and 1970, world Zionism was dominated by that current. And what they did was they sort of said, well, in Europe and outside of Palestine, we are socialists. But when we get to Palestine, we go along with the Nakba, we go along with the expulsion, we go along with Jewish supremacy and all that sort of stuff. So it's a very illogical position. The question is, what are the proportions? And I just want to read a quote. How important, in other words, was Zionism as part of the mass Jewish movement? And we have a very simple social experiment that took place, which was when 4 million people were driven from Western Europe by the pogroms, but from Eastern Europe by the pogroms. They had a simple choice. You could either go to Palestine, which is where the Zionists tell you to go, or you can go anywhere else, which is where the Marxists and the Bund say you can go, right? So what are the proportions? 1 in 27 went to Palestine. So that means 26 out of 27 went anywhere else but Palestine. Okay, so that tells you something. Just have I got time for the quote? Yes, very, very quickly. This is a quote from a guy called Walter Lacker, who wrote, actually he's a Zionist, but he wrote a very good history of Zionism. And he writes about Zionism in 1933, when the year Hitler comes to power. He says, how little Zionism had achieved in its previous 3 decades. It had not won over the Jewish masses. Of 4 million American Jews, only 80,000 voted in the Zionist elections. In Romania, 40,000 voted out of 500,000. In Hungary, 5,000 out of a community of 500,000. German Jews, the majority were actively opposed. In Britain, the majority are indifferent or even actively hostile. So that tells you about the various currents. So what's going on in Palestine is a complete break, actually, from the radical Jewish tradition. And the break, you can tell it through the language. Yiddish was the language of the mass of people, whether they're workers or not, actually, middle class and upper class. They spoke Yiddish in Europe. In 1910, between 1910 and 11, Ben-Gurion, who's going to be the first prime minister, says, you are not allowed to use Yiddish anymore in your exchanges. You have to speak Hebrew. In other words, he was smashing the culture. And Hebrew, by the way, was a dead language that had been revived in 1895 by a guy called Israel Ben Yehuda. So it's a complete break from the radical Jewish tradition. What exists in Israel was a break. They could pretend that they were radicals, but they weren't. Finally, the sad bit, which I need to do because I'm running out of time, is that the radical Jewish tradition suffered a major, almost total destruction. And we need to ask why. And it's really three forces that need to be mentioned. First one is Stalinism. Stalin not only destroyed the gains of the Russian Revolution, but he was anti-Semitic. He used anti-Semitism, and therefore, if you'd identified with that tradition, and all of a sudden the leader of it, who's supposed to be actually existing socialism, as they called it, is an anti-Semite, then that's a problem. But that's not nearly as big a problem as Hitler and the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, there are 11 million Jews living in Europe, 6 in the world. Hitler manages to kill 6 million of them, and the vast majority of them would have been, especially if you didn't have the money and the resources to get out, would have been radical working class Jews. So that, and then the final thing, the final nail in the coffin was all the rest of the governments of the world, all the capitalist governments, because during the 1930s, Hitler comes to power in 1933, 1939, the war breaks out and it's difficult to move. You can't just move across borders. In that 6-year period, what happened to the refugees that are fleeing? Door after door shuts. It doesn't matter whether it's Brazil or whether it's Shanghai or whether it's the United States or Britain or France, you name it, they slam the doors. So all of these ideas of solidarity become very difficult to sustain in that situation. And I'll finish there, apart from one thing, to say that it almost died, but it didn't. We'll talk about that later, perhaps.
Thank you, Donny. And now, it's my honor to introduce Janey, Janey Stone. Janey's mother sought refuge in Australia from Polish anti-Semitism in 1930s. Janey is a lifelong socialist and political activist. She has been a union delegate and has participated in the student, anti-Vietnam War, and women's liberation movements. As an anti-Zionist Jew, she has written and presented about resistance to the Nazis in Germany and Poland, and by Jews, and by many other topics, including women workers, sexual politics, the Middle East, and the radical Jewish tradition. Janey is retired and lives in Melbourne. She has a leadership role in Interventions, Australia's only independent, not-for-profit radical publishing company. Please give a huge round of applause and welcome Janey.
Okay, so I'm going to start off a little bit like Donny did, again, as talking about why a book like this matters today. Because after all, the book ends in 1948, which was nearly 80 years ago. So some people might think this is a niche history, you know, interesting, but really not important for us in the world today. But let's just consider, in the last few weeks, there have been several very significant anniversaries. 8th of March, International Women's Day, and also the February Revolution in Russia. 13th of April, Holocaust Remembrance Day. 19th of April, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. 21st of April, Israeli so-called Independence Day. And then 1st of May, May Day, great workers, international workers' holiday, and only a couple of days ago, Nakba Day. So they're all snugly together. You have the themes for our book and our event this afternoon: anti-Semitism, resistance and struggle, oppression, Zionism, Palestine, revolution and socialism, all in the last couple of months. So the role of Jews in the world, Jewish history and heritage, Jewish political currents, such as Zionism, are all making headlines every day and couldn't be more contemporary. When the Zionists invoke Jewish history as a justification for their support of history, an alternative view of that history becomes very immediate and urgent. And when the Zionists keep harping on the image of Israel as the victim, they are continuing in a long tradition that we need to look at. And that tradition is something that is called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Now, lachrymose is just a sort of fancy word for tearful. So the tearful conception of Jewish history. And that's the idea that the main experience of Jewish people has been suffering. It's always been this way, and it can't be changed. And in other words, Jews are eternal victims. Now, there's three ways you can respond to this idea. Firstly, you can say, we can't do anything about it, about anti-Semitism. So we withdraw into our ghettos, customs and religion, we do nothing, and we remain victims. Now, the second option is to get away from being a victim by joining the perpetrators, become an exploiter and an oppressor yourself, or at least side with those who do so. Now, Zionism is really a combination of both of those. The Zionists start by saying that we can't do anything about anti-Semitism and non-Jews will always be anti-Semitic. But then they say the way to stop being victims is to take lessons and guidance from the colonialists and the imperialists and the ruling class, and even from the anti-Semites themselves. Let's set up our own state and become just like them. But there is actually a third option. And in our book, Donny and I show that while the oppression and suffering have certainly been there, it's not true that Jews are nothing but victims. They've always resisted and fought back. So the radical tradition is the history of working class and socialist Jewish struggle against both anti-Semitism and their position at the bottom of society, against both oppression and exploitation. And it's the tradition that says we can fight to defend ourselves. The tradition that knows what anti-Semitism is, but doesn't just accept it as eternal or plan to go somewhere and set yourself up as the oppressor of someone else. And this is a tradition that has historically been entwined with the working class and socialist movements. So what we've done in this book is to rediscover this history and set it in the context of the fight against anti-Semitism and the role of Jews in the socialist and radical movements between the 1880s and 1948. We've got a copy of the book here.
It's right here.
So that's what I'm talking about. Doing the research and finding out so much that was new to me was a very exciting journey. So now I want to take you on some of the stops on that journey and link them up to those anniversaries. So first of all, anti-Semitism. Not the Holocaust to start off with, but pogroms in Tsarist Russia. Now, previously, the main image I had was of frightened Jews huddling in synagogues. When you say the word pogrom, that's the image you get. So I was amazed, actually, myself, to discover that there was serious resistance to the pogroms. The Jewish Labour Bund, which Donny briefly mentioned, was a very important revolutionary organization set up in 1897 in Tsarist Russia. And the Jewish Labour Bund was very critical for the early socialist movement. But today, I mainly want to focus on their role in Jewish self-defense. So the Bund actually put out a call for armed self-defense after a horrific pogrom in Kishinev in 1903. And the quote from them is this: "We must come out with arms in hand, organize ourselves, and fight to our last drop of blood. Only when we show our strength will we force everyone to respect our honor." So the self-defense groups led by the Bund, were led by the Bund, but in coalition with radical and socialist groups, because they didn't see the issue as just about Jews. What they said was that the struggle against anti-Semitism was, quote, also directed against the ruling class and for socialism. Thus, the two struggles were one, end quote. So, like almost all stories in our book, this is a story not only of resistance and struggle, but also of solidarity. And these self-defense groups actually sometimes had successes. For instance, in 1906 in Białystok in Poland, they were able to completely protect the major working class sections of the city. So again, a quote: "At every corner of the poor section of Białystok, patrols of the Jewish Self-Defense League were stationed with revolvers and grenades. They would guard the streets. They guarded the streets and fired warning shots into the air. If a Gentile went by carrying loot, they would frighten him until he threw down the stolen package and fled." Now, that's a very different picture to huddling in synagogues, isn't it? Nonetheless, pogroms did continue, and the poverty and misery of life in Tsarist Russia led to hundreds of thousands of Jews emigrating, as Donny said, all over the world: the UK, the US, Australia, and other countries, Canada. US doesn't cover Canada, obviously. And this led to a new era of struggle and resistance. So the stories from the US are fascinating. There was almost continuous struggle in the Jewish areas of New York from the late 19th century until World War II, as Jewish men and women fought the bosses and the state with the support of socialist organizations. In the early period, there was strike after strike as Jewish workers fought to establish trade unions. And then after the turn of the century, activity moved into the community. So this is one of my favorite stories. In May 1902, there was an increase in the retail price of kosher meat, and this outraged housewives in the Lower East Side, and a crowd of 20,000 women set out. And according to one newspaper, an excitable and aroused crowd, mostly of women, roamed the streets, armed with sticks, vocabularies, and well-sharpened nails. The police attacked, but they didn't have it all their own way. One woman retaliated by slapping a cop in the face with a moist piece of liver. When the issue spread to Brooklyn, the New York Times had this headline: "Brooklyn mob loots butchers' shops. Rioters, led by women, wreck a dozen stores. Dance around bonfires of oil-drenched meat piled in the street. Fierce fight with the police." And then the newspaper went on in the body of the story: "The mob ran through the streets, howling in their peculiar Russian and Polish dialects, wrecking with stones and other missiles every butcher's shop in their path. When the police arrived, the women threw bottles, stones, and whatever they could place their hands on. Women shook their fists in their faces and tore off their shields and buttons from their coats. There was a charge on the mob, and nightsticks were freely used." So the Times newspaper ended by calling for the repression of this dangerous class, especially the women, who are very ignorant. When a magistrate asked one woman why they were rioting, she replied, "We don't riot, but if all we did was to weep at home, nobody would notice it." The lachrymose conception again. So the meat boycott was followed by a series of rent strikes, again led by women. And then the community action fed back into the workplace in 1908 and 1909 with the uprising of the 20,000, when female Jewish garment workers went on strike over piecework work rates and other issues. Probably many of you are familiar with that strike. Leading up to that strike, socialists called a large parade. And this demonstration was so successful that German socialist Clara Zetkin proposed an International Working Women's Day in 1910, which has continued ever since. So it's worth remembering that in talking about the Jewish radical tradition, we are commemorating also the real heritage of International Women's Day, which is Jewish, socialist, and working class. So there's much more I could say about New York, but I now want to head over to London. In the East End, the conditions they lived and worked in were indescribable. But from very early on, there were Jewish socialists. The early Jewish radical movement in London is full of stories about all sorts of currents: anarchists, socialists, trade unionists, Marxists, many other currents. And over decades, Jewish workers struggled against the sweating system and their appalling working and living conditions. But they didn't do this alone, which is critical. So 1889 was a very big strike here in London. And when the Jewish tailors went on strike, they received a large donation from dockers who had themselves just been on strike. And this doesn't sound like that much, a donation from one workers group to another, but it's actually hugely significant because the dockers were largely Irish Catholics. And there's no doubt there was anti-Semitic prejudice amongst them. Then, only a decade or so later, in 1912, 20 years later, during a major dock strike in 1912, Jewish families took in and cared for dockers' children, which enabled them to win their strike. And then, 24 years later again, the dockers again returned the favour. Some of you, maybe not all of you, but some of you will have heard of the mass demonstration at Cable Street in London, in the London East End in 1936, when up to 300,000 people rallied to protest a planned march by the British Union of Fascists led by Oswald Mosley. The dockers constituted the militant vanguard of this mass demonstration. So this sequence of mutual support peaked at that point. And one of the participants, Bill Fishman, described it this way: "I was moved to tears to see bearded Jews and Irish Catholic dockers standing up to stop Mosley. I shall never forget that day as long as I live, how working class people could get together to oppose the evil of fascism." So now I'm going to move back to Europe on that topic of fascism. With rising anti-Semitism in Poland in the 1930s, the Bund again set up self-defense groups. Now, the Bund didn't want confrontations to be between Poles and Jews, but between fascists and anti-fascists. So they deliberately drew in non-Jewish workers. And the Bund and the Polish Socialist Party collaborated over May Day parades, and there were also general strikes against pogroms and against anti-Semitic attacks. The habit of cooperation built up over many years meant that when the Nazis invaded in 1939, thousands of Jews were able to find a hiding place in the apartments of non-Jewish workers. So this brings us to the war and the Holocaust, and also to the worst of the myth of Jewish passivity, victimhood, that Jews went to the concentration camps like lambs to the slaughter. So some of you may not know this. Did you know that there were underground resistance movements in about 100 ghettos and armed uprisings in 50? There were also uprisings in 21 concentration camps, and Jewish partisans fought in about 50 partisan groups in the forests. And in addition, about 10,000 people survived in family camps, also in the forests. And then there was sabotage, where forced labourers in shoe factories put nails in the boots, and tailors sewed left arms into right armholes and vice versa of the uniforms that they were being forced to make. And then there was a whole lot of support from non-Jews, solidarity, helping to hide Jews, even though people risked being put to death themselves. And that's a very big story in its own right. But connecting two of my anniversary themes, I just want to go into now to tell you how members of the Jewish fighting organization during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943, which is also a very big story that I don't have time to talk about today. But you imagine they're actually in the middle of that uprising, fighting the Nazis who are burning down the ghetto around them. They actually gathered on May Day. And this is what Marek Edelman, the Bund member in the Jewish leader in the Jewish fighting organization, described them there in the middle of the uprising. The entire world we knew was celebrating May Day, and everywhere forceful and meaningful words were being spoken. But never yet had the Internationale been sung in conditions so different, so tragic, in a place where an entire nation had been and was still perishing. The words and the song echoed from the charred ruins, an indication that socialist youth was still fighting in the ghetto. So there are so many more stories I could tell you, but if I told you all of them, you wouldn't buy the book. I want to end with just one more. The story of the couriers who lived illegally outside the ghettos, pretending to be non-Jews, and travelled between the ghettos, maintaining communications. Now, the majority of these couriers were women, and the reason for that is something we call the pants drop test. It's not obvious to everybody, but this is a period when Jewish men were circumcised, but most Jewish men were not circumcised. So the women were safer in living in those illegal circumstances. So these couriers smuggled people, cash, fake IDs, underground publications, information, and weapons. They hid items in their clothes, in their bras, in sanitary napkins, in their shoes, and in sacks of potatoes. They smuggled guns in loaves of bread and coded messages in their plaited hair. Most of these women were members of Jewish socialist youth groups or communists. Their stories are full of the kind of material that usually makes it into film and notoriety, yet they are virtually unknown. The couriers endured prison, rape, humiliation, and beatings and kept on fighting. The astonishing bravery, intelligence, resourcefulness, drive, determination, and self-sacrifice of these women fully destroys the myth that Jews went as sheep to the slaughter. So now I'll just finish up by saying that the Zionists and government leaders and the ruling classes in Canada and the UK and Australia and everywhere really don't want you to know this alternative history. They prefer that you think that Jews huddled in the synagogues or went to the execution like sheep to the slaughter, because they can instrumentalize these images and maintain the fiction that Israel is a victim, as Jews supposedly always have been. But I want to leave you with an alternative image. Jews as revolutionaries, resistance fighters, and firebrands, the subtitle of our book, joining in solidarity with non-Jews in the fight against all forms of oppression and in the struggle for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Janey. And now it's my privilege to welcome our respondents. So I'm honored to invite Judy Rebick, who is a longtime socialist activist and writer in Toronto. Judy will speak to us for about 10 minutes. Thank you.
when Carolyn asked me to speak today, I said, I don't know anything about radical Jewish history, but I'm glad she did because I've learned a lot today. And also I was reading Molly Crabapple's book, or starting to read it. But I did not grow up with this idea that Jews were led to slaughter. My father was a Brooklyn gangster, okay? So I grew up with the idea of fight back, not of Jews as passive, at all, ever. So it's interesting. In fact, when I was 10, when we moved to Canada, I was 10, and we lived in Brooklyn. Everybody in Brooklyn was Jewish. So I'd never experienced anti-Semitism. And my mother, who was not like my father at all, my mother sat me down and said, okay, she said, somebody might call you dirty Jew, but it's not their fault. Their parents have educated them wrong, and you just need to talk to them. So I said, okay. So I was on my bike, and it was the first few days of school. And then this girl yells at me, dirty Jew. So what am I going to do? My mother said, I can't call her dirty Christian back. That's not right. So I got off my bike and I punched her. That's what my father would do. Anyway, so I never got called dirty Jew again in my class. Anyway, and also the history of the radical Jews I knew because when I became a Trotskyist, and I told my Aunt Seal, who lived in Brooklyn, who's the authoritarian in the family, that I was a communist. And she said, is that old-fashioned? So I kind of knew that about the history when you said how many of the people accused by McCarthy were Jews. I knew all about that. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism around that. So, but I'm not familiar with the history. So Carolyn said, yes, but what about Morgenthaler? So, and that's probably, I went to Israel in 1970, not because I was interested in Israel, but because I was a hippie, traveling around the world, and people said I could get a job there. And that's probably the first time I radicalized around being Jewish, because I couldn't stand it there. Like the racism against what we called then Arabs. I didn't even know the word Palestinian. I was horrified. I said, this has nothing to do with what I grew up with as a Jew. And I recognize that without knowing anything, okay, just from my own experience. But when I came back, in those days, like 1970, everybody was pro-Israel, Exodus and all that stuff. So I didn't do much for a long time after that in terms of fighting against, being an anti-Zionist, but I was an anti-Zionist. It's how I became a Marxist, is I read a book called The Jewish Question, not by Marx, the other guy. Engels. And about how that Zionism was Jews allying with the oppressor, and that Jews should be allied with the oppressed. And I agreed with that. And I read that probably in 1971 or 72. And it's really what moved me toward becoming a Marxist. So I don't know the history, and I didn't, I really didn't identify much as Jewish. In fact, I probably spent more time thinking about being Jewish in the last 2 years than I have in the whole rest of my life. But Dr. Morgenthaler, as I'm sure all of, maybe not our guests, but everybody in the room knows, Dr. Morgenthaler was a survivor of concentration camp when he was a young child. And that was central to why he was so courageous in serving women in his clinic. Basically the way it happened was women would come to him and ask him for abortions, and it was illegal. And he just didn't think that was fair, right? And he used to say, and Carolyn, correct me if I'm wrong, he used to say, I, who could have been a grain of sand, decided that since I survived, I had to spend the rest of my life helping others. And so he always made his Judaism central to his struggle. And as you know, he went to jail and then came here, opened the clinic, and was prepared to go to jail again if necessary. That didn't happen. But without his courage, as well as not just his courage, but also his presentation of himself because I think he presented himself as the little guy up against the system, as the one who almost died in a concentration camp and came back to fight to help women. And I think that that presentation that he had of himself, as well as, I guess he was somewhat charismatic, not so much if you knew him, but on television. You know, that people connected with him as a little guy up against the system, right? And we faced a lot of anti-Semitism in those days, right? So, and it was all from the anti-choice. So the funny story is Norma Scarborough, who we used to work with, said she was standing behind Dr. Morgenthaler and Dr. Scott. Now you won't remember, most of you won't remember Dr. Scott, but Dr. Scott was like a 6'3" blonde guy, okay? Like the most guyish guy you ever saw. Not to mention his name is Dr. Scott. You know? But anyway, he's walking along and, you know, Morgenthaler was Jewish, I was Jewish, and Morgenthaler's lawyer was Jewish, right? So there, but the lawyer and Dr. Morgenthaler and Dr. Scott walking together, and one anti-choice person says to another, funny, he doesn't look Jewish. And then, but the other part that's not so funny is the number of times that I'd be at the clinic or others at the clinic, and the anti-choice would yell at the women going in, you know, they only kill Christian babies in there, right? It was really shocking. But that wasn't the only thing. The Toronto Sun ran a cartoon that was like a Hitler cartoon of a Jew, right? So there was not, it wasn't coming from the ruling class particularly, it was coming from the far right in those days, the anti-choice. Actually, I got attacked by a Zionist in the street the other day, and she was just like an anti-choice person. Like I hadn't went into that in a long time. But anyway, so that was, his Jewish history was very much part of his, I wouldn't call it radicalism, but his courage in fighting back and standing up against all odds. And, you know, since the attack, well, I mean, we organized a group of Jewish women. I was just looking at the video the other day, Alice here, who was part of it. In 2009, there was an attack on Gaza, not as brutal, but pretty brutal. And we organized a group of 8 Jewish women. We occupied the Israeli consulate. And that was quite an experience, I won't get into it because I don't have time. I was going to time myself and then I didn't, but anyway, I won't get into the details, but it was interesting because we got it. I mean, I don't think we realized it quite at the time, but we got a taste of what was coming in the sense that in the Middle East, our occupation was front page news. It was the lead in Al Jazeera, on Al Jazeera Arabic, right? It was the lead in a lot of papers throughout the Middle East. In fact, a couple of Palestinian friends said to me, you know, that action did more to combat anti-Semitism in the Middle East than anything, right? And I learned a lesson from that, which is that from now, because the Zionist propaganda is all about how all Jews support this, right? And it's by Jews, like I know I'm wearing this, I don't run this shirt anymore, people attack me, but, and I used to be able to defend myself, and I'm too old now, so I can defend myself verbally really well, but you know, it comes to a fist fight on it, I'm not about going. So anyway, yeah, so the way in which Jews across North America and Europe have been standing, especially in Britain, but have been standing up visibly as Jews against Zionism and against what Israel's doing in Gaza and against the genocide. This has been so important to make sure that anti-Semitism, which you know, the right, and Naomi Klein uses the term, she says the right harvests anger, right? And I really like that metaphor, because if there's anti-Semitism, the right can really take advantage. I mean, the right uses anti-Semitism to harvest anger against Jews, right? And I think that if it wasn't for the fact that we have such a visible Jewish presence in the pro-Palestinian movement, we'd be seeing more anti-Semitism on the left than we do. But it is starting to happen in small ways, and I think we have to be aware of it, and we have to always stand up against any form of discrimination or hatred. And the best way to do that is right now, is to stand up against Israel as Jews, which is why I've been, like I say, more Jewish in the last 2 years than I have the whole rest of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Now I'd like to invite Julia Barnett, who is a longtime committed Toronto-based socialist feminist, member of the Independent Jewish Voices, and Palestinian Solidarity and Labor activist.
Well, we're going to start on two notes. I think I got to start that I grew up in Skokie, Illinois, in Chicago, suburb of Chicago, and my first, well, one of my first memories of being kind of a little different than some of my friends was when I came home from school one day and said that I want to go and fight the Nazis. And my dad said, "Fantastic, let me get the baseball bat." My mother said, "What the fuck? You're going in." All right, so that's how it kind of started for me. But and then secondly, I just want to say that I have so many great ideas for the next demonstration with chopped liver, what can we do? Anyway, so but I did want to just say that for my experience, having moved to Canada in 1986, 87, and since then was my influence and impact by so many socialist feminists, some sitting in this room today, Carolyn Egan and Judy Rebick, and not using identity of being Jewish, but our history of long-term radical Jewish tradition and standing up for and making links from both the pro-choice movement and other struggles, particularly in the labor movement, for me, and building on that. So it's hard to disengage or to separate that piece out. But I would say three areas that that continue on the tradition that you're talking about from 40. I can't speak from 48 to 2008, but I can speak from my own political struggle and history. Was and is when I came here, I didn't have any family here. I had a lot of political friends and comrades, but United Jewish People's Order, which has a long-standing history here within the Canadian state, and it is now moving into our 100th anniversary coming next month. And so there's a lot of activities around that, is that the people who built United Jewish People's Order, which I won't go into great detail because David Wall will be speaking this week about it and making the links, is the longtime history of both labor, social movements, women's rights, equal and human rights, which also, I believe, is part and parcel of how the Bund also fought against anti-Semitism and was on the cusp of what, during that period of the social democratic movements of the time, which was social democracy in multiple ways. And I feel that history and that connection that I have, or I bring to that history, is part and parcel of what United Jewish People's Order's legacy and history of activism is. We've had multiple political debates on so many different questions, and it still exists as an organization that allows for those who are Jewish, who don't come out of what I would call the mainstream or Orthodox community, but rather a history of progressive and political human rights and the building of the labor movement. And that's a legacy that I think will continue, and playing both a leadership role, but also an activist role within UJPO to move the organization, I think is part and parcel of some of that history, and want to bring that piece to galvanize around what radical Jewish history is and what it is today. The second area that I wanted to focus on is not just my role in Independent Jewish Voices. There are members here today. When we gathered in over almost a decade ago now around Palestine solidarity and anti-occupation There were various different degrees of debate around Zionism at the time, and I can gladly say and proud to say that we have been able to win a position of anti-Zionism within the organization today because of the struggles of so many of us building with Palestinians, taking a leadership role from the Palestinian leadership, and working in solidarity and as allies. And that independent Jewish voices with our allies, with other political movements across the board, but particularly our allyship with the Palestinian struggle continues today. And we have had many successes. We've had many challenges and struggles, but as an organization across the country, we continue to do that work of radical Jewish tradition, and we work very closely with our non-Jewish members as well. So, which is key to I think, the political current that we're in today. That we organize as Jews when we need to, and as radical Jews, but we work as allies regardless of our identity around these struggles. The third area that I want to talk about is the labor movement. That I would say that many of us have been quite involved in the labor movement within the Canadian state, both in English Canada and Quebec. But in particular, I want to give an example of some of this tradition that is now key to the current period. Many of us are involved in Labor for Palestine. I'm involved in Labor for Palestine through both the caucus, through the union that I'm in, the APSU caucus, but also as independent Jewish voices who are very involved in both the labor movement and in Labor for Palestine. And how do we integrate this politic? Part of it is that when we're doing education for Labor for Palestine at the local level, when we're trying to reach rank and file members, because quite often I have to say that the organized labor movement and certainly the leaderships of many of the locals don't want this debate to take place. And we've been able to, those of us who are part of Labor for Palestine and Independent Jewish Voices have been able to really integrate those lessons. So when you're talking of Palestine Solidarity 101, we're also talking about what is Zionism 101 and creating and making space for understanding that history. And this is what we try to do. And we're doing it. I don't know how well we're doing it, but I think we are doing it. We were able to just pass. And I think this has a lot to do with, like, you know, to remove ourselves from the history at the CLC level. That is an amazing piece. And that was done because we united all of Labor for Palestine and activists through the labor movement, but also as Jews speaking out at the labor movement level, saying this tie has to be broken immediately. And so it's just one example. It's also an example of hot cargo and the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the lessons we learned from South Africa and what we were able to gain there, both as Jews and as activists and as allies, what we're able to try to do here around BDS, whether it be hard cargo and military opposition to the militarization and weapons, or whether it be through hot cargo, and that's boycotting and consumer products. So I think we need this book. We need this history. So one, we don't forget it, but also to remind others that we are not all the same, and two, to continue that history because it continues. And I just want to thank you for writing it and sharing it, and for us to be able to make those links. And the struggle continues, and it will not end here. So thank you.